There's a case file that officially doesn't exist anymore, because the man who kept it spent one afternoon 11 years ago feeding 41 years of personal field notebooks into a burn barrel behind his house. And the only reason any of it survives at all is that his daughter, without telling him, photographed about 60 pages of it the week before he did it. Because she'd noticed him getting quieter every October for longer than she could remember, and she wanted to understand why before whatever he was carrying disappeared with him. Those photographs are the reason we're able to bring you this story tonight. The man is a retired Michigan conservation officer, 31 years with the Department of Natural Resources, almost all of it in the Upper Peninsula. And he agreed to talk to us on the condition that we never use his real name, never name the county, and never describe the exact terrain closely enough that someone could triangulate it on a map. Before we get into this, if this is your first time on the channel, hit subscribe. We bring you documented testimony like this every week, from people who have spent careers in places most of us will never go, and if you leave without subscribing, the algorithm probably won't put this in front of you again. The button's right there, now let's get into it. We're going to call him Warden Holt for this video. He's 68 now, retired for 6 years, and for 31 years before that he worked as a conservation officer for the Michigan DNR. Patrolling a stretch of the Upper Peninsula that included dense second-growth hardwood and hemlock forest, a scattering of beaver flowages, and enough genuinely roadless country that, in his own words, there were sections of his patrol area a man could walk into and not see another human being for 4 or 5 days running. Even during firearm deer season, when the woods are supposedly full of people. Holt grew up downstate, came up to the UP for college, and never left, which he says happens to almost everybody who moves up there for the right reasons instead of the wrong ones. He describes his early career, the first 10 or 12 years, as almost entirely what you'd expect from a game warden's job, checking licenses, investigating poaching complaints, working with state biologists on deer population surveys, occasionally getting called out to help state police with a lost hunter or a snowmobile accident. Nothing in that first decade, he told us, gave him any reason to believe the woods he was patrolling held anything the biology textbooks hadn't already accounted for. To understand how thoroughly Holt believed he knew his patrol district before any of this began, it helps to understand the scale of the job itself. A single conservation officer in the Upper Peninsula during those years might be responsible for patrolling several hundred square miles of mixed public and private land. A territory that included state forest, national forest, private timber holdings, and scattered rural residential parcels. Much of it connected only by unpaved logging roads that could become impassable for weeks at a time depending on the season. Holt describes spending literal years of his career, cumulatively, alone in a truck or on foot in country that most people, even most Michiganders, will never see in their lifetime. That kind of exposure, he says, builds a particular kind of confidence, the sense that you have genuinely come to know a piece of land as well as it can be known by any single human being. That changed gradually and then not so gradually, starting in what he estimates was his 11th or 12th year on the job, sometime in the mid-1980s. And to understand what he eventually documented, and why he eventually burned almost all the proof of it, you have to understand the shape of what happened to him in roughly the order it happened. Because he was insistent more than once during our conversation that the order matters. He said if you tell this story out of order, it sounds like a monster story. Told in order, it sounds like something closer to a natural history he never wanted to be the one writing. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know if you've ever worked a job that puts you alone in truly remote wilderness for extended stretches, forestry, wildland firefighting, backcountry ranger work, anything like that. That kind of prolonged solitary exposure to wild country changes how a person reads the woods, and it's exactly the kind of background that makes a testimony like this one worth taking seriously. Now back to Holt. The first thing Holt wants people to understand is that he'd heard dogmen stories his entire career before he ever had a reason to believe them. Michigan has one of the richest modern folklore traditions around a bipedal, canine-featured cryptid of any state in the country, stories that predate the internet by decades. And Holt says every conservation officer who's worked the northern part of the state for any length of time has fielded at least a few calls that, if you strip away the caller's embarrassment, sound exactly like a dogman encounter. A deer hunter who saw something upright at the tree line at last light and won't go back to that stand. A snowmobiler who found tracks crossing a trail that looked wrong, too long a stride, too deep for the apparent size. He treated all of it, for most of his career, the way any professional wildlife officer treats folklore, respectfully, without argument, and privately as almost certainly misidentified bear. What changed his mind wasn't a dogman sighting of his own. That's the detail he kept circling back to because it upends the story people expect to hear. What changed his mind was something else entirely, something that at first he assumed was evidence against the dogman legend, not evidence for a second, even stranger animal underneath it. Before we go further, drop a comment if you've heard dogman stories from your own region, whether in Michigan or elsewhere, and whether you ever expected those stories to connect to something even less documented sitting behind them. That layering, one cryptid story concealing another, is at the center of everything Holt eventually pieced together. Now let's get into what he actually found. It started, as far as Holt can reconstruct it now, with carcasses. Specifically, over a period of about 4 years in the mid to late 1980s, Holt began encountering, during routine patrol and during responses to reported large animal sightings from landowners, remains that didn't fit any species on his checklist and that he initially, and for years afterward, cataloged informally as probable bear kills of bear. An admittedly strange but not impossible category given how territorial and occasionally cannibalistic black bears can be under food stress. The first one he specifically remembers was in his case notes as an unlabeled entry, no formal report filed, because at the time he genuinely didn't know what to file it under. He'd responded to a landowner complaint about a foul smell near a hay barn on the edge of a large parcel bordering national forest land, and what he found, roughly 80 yards into the tree line, was a partial carcass that he initially assumed was a black bear, given the coarse dark hair still clinging to sections of hide. But the skeletal structure, once he'd cleared enough of the site to get a real look, didn't match bear morphology. The limb proportions were wrong for a bear. The skull, badly damaged but partially intact, showed a jaw structure and dentition pattern that Holt, with years of experience examining bear kills and bear predation sites as part of his job, could not reconcile with any black bear skull he'd ever handled. He remembers the specific quality of that afternoon with unusual clarity for something that happened so many decades ago, a detail he attributes to how disorienting it felt in the moment. Standing in a stretch of woods he'd walked dozens of times before, looking at something his own trained eye simply couldn't process correctly. He describes crouching next to the remains for what felt like a very long time, running through every species on his mental checklist: bear, wolf, coyote, even domestic dog gone feral, and having each one fail to fit as he examined the jaw more closely. The dentition pattern in particular stuck with him. A combination of tooth shapes that seemed to blend characteristics he associated separately with carnivores and with something closer to omnivorous primates, a combination that, as far as he knew then and still believes now, doesn't exist in any cataloged North American species. What he could reconcile it with, though he didn't let himself say the word out loud for years, was the general shape of the animal described in every dogman account he'd ever half-listened to and mentally filed under local color. Before we continue, drop a comment if you can imagine standing over remains like that in your own line of work, trying to force an explanation that fits your training, and slowly realizing the explanation isn't going to come easily. That tension between professional caution and what your own eyes are telling you runs through this entire testimony. Now let's keep going. Holt did what any careful field officer would do. He photographed the site extensively with a department camera, collected what bone fragments he reasonably could without a full excavation permit, and brought the material back to compare against reference materials in the regional office, expecting, he told us, that someone with more taxonomic training than him would take one look and give him an answer that closed the case in an afternoon. That's not what happened. The regional wildlife biologist he consulted, a man Holt still considers one of the sharpest field biologists he ever worked alongside, spent the better part of a week with the material and came back with an answer that unsettled Holt more than a confident misidentification would have. The biologist told him, off the record, in a conversation Holt describes as one of the strangest 10 minutes of his entire career, that whatever the remains belonged to showed morphological characteristics inconsistent with any documented North American canid, ursid, or primate, but that the skeletal wear patterns and the apparent cause of death were, in the biologist's professional opinion, consistent with a violent predation event, not disease, not starvation. Not a vehicle strike. Something had killed this animal, whatever it was, and killed it with considerable force. Neither man filed anything formal. Holt is candid about why, and it's a theme that recurs through the rest of this testimony. A wildlife officer who submits an official report describing an unidentified bipedal canid carcass invites exactly the kind of scrutiny that ends careers, not through any explicit punishment, but through the slow, informal erosion of credibility that follows anyone in a public-facing government role who's perceived as chasing cryptids instead of doing their job. Holt watched it happen later in his career to a colleague in a neighboring district who made the mistake of mentioning an anomalous sighting during a staff meeting, half as a joke. That colleague spent the next several years fielding gentle jokes from supervisors about Bigfoot patrol, jokes that were never quite hostile enough to formally object to, and never quite friendly enough to ignore. The biologist Holt consulted, whom we'll refer to simply as the regional biologist for this video since he's since passed away, and Holt didn't want to name him even posthumously without a family member's consent, had a doctorate in wildlife ecology, and had spent his own career studying predator-prey dynamics among the region's wolf and coyote populations. Holt describes him as exactly the kind of scientist who should have been the ideal person to bring a discovery like this to rigorous, careful. And by that point in his career secure enough in his own professional standing that a strange consultation from a trusted game warden wasn't going to threaten anything. And yet even he, according to Holt, insisted on keeping the entire exchange verbal and off the record, a decision Holt has come to understand more with each passing year, even as it frustrated him deeply at the time. Before we go on, drop a comment if you've ever watched a colleague's professional reputation take a quiet, informal hit after they shared something genuinely strange they'd experienced on the job, even when nobody explicitly punished them for it. It's a pattern that shows up constantly in testimony like this, and it's exactly why so many of these stories stay buried for decades. Now, back to Holt. That first unidentified carcass, in what Holt now retroactively refers to as Case 1, though he never used that language at the time, sat in his memory as an unresolved anomaly for almost 2 full years before the second one turned up. And it's the gap and the pattern across that gap that Holt considers, looking back with the full weight of 31 years of hindsight, the real beginning of understanding what he was actually documenting. Holt describes those 2 years, between Case 1 and Case 2, as a period he now recognizes as a kind of quiet psychological negotiation with himself, trying to decide whether what he'd found was a genuine discovery worth pursuing, or an aberration he should simply let go of and move on from. He says he went back to that hay barn site more than once during those 2 years, alone on his own time, walking the same stretch of tree line, half hoping to find some mundane explanation he'd overlooked the first time, a discarded taxidermy specimen, some kind of hoax, anything that would let him close the question in his own mind. He never found ones. His wife at the time, he told us, noticed the change in him during those 2 years without fully understanding its source, a new habit of quiet distraction, of staring out toward the tree line during dinner on their back porch in a way she eventually, gently, asked him about. He told her only a partial version of the truth, that he'd found something strange on a call and it was bothering him without going into the specifics, a pattern of partial disclosure that he now recognizes set the tone for the rest of their marriage's slow, quiet erosion over the following decades. Case 2 came in the fall during archery season, roughly 22 miles from the location of Case 1 as the crow flies, in a different township. Reported by a bow hunter who'd found what he described to Holt over the phone as a bear carcass that smelled wrong and looked wrong lying in a creek bottom below his stand. Holt drove out expecting, based on the caller's description, something mundane, and instead found remains that matched the morphological anomalies of Case 1 closely enough that he brought his own department camera and took measurements he compared directly against his notes from 2 years earlier that same night. Sitting in his truck in the dark with a flashlight, going through his own old Case notebook page by page. He describes that specific night, alone in his truck at the edge of that creek bottom, as one of the moments he returns to most often when he thinks back over his entire career, more than any of the more dramatic encounters that came later. There was something about the quiet, methodical act of comparing measurements by flashlight, watching numbers line up with numbers from 2 years earlier, That made the reality of what he was documenting feel more solid than any single dramatic sighting could have. He remembers writing, in the margin of that night's entry, a single line that he says captures exactly how he felt in that moment. Something to the effect that whatever this was, it was not going away, and he was going to have to decide what kind of officer he wanted to be about it. The proportions matched. Not identically, there was clear size variation between the two specimens that Holt interpreted cautiously as evidence of at least two distinct individuals rather than the same animal encountered twice. But the general skeletal architecture, the jaw structure, the limb ratios, all fell within a range that told him, with a certainty he still describes as unsettling even now, that he was looking at the same unidentified species twice in 2 years. In two locations more than 20 miles apart. Before we continue, drop a comment if you want to guess, at this point in the story, what Holt eventually came to believe these remains actually were before we tell you. It's rarely the first guess people land on, and that's part of what makes this testimony different from a typical DOGMEN account. Now let's get into what Holt started to suspect. For a long time, Holt's working theory, the one he wrote down in his private notebook in careful, hedged language because he genuinely wasn't sure of it, was that he was documenting an unrecognized North American great ape or ape-adjacent primate, essentially a version of the classic Bigfoot hypothesis. An undiscovered hominid surviving in low densities across the northern forests, occasionally dying of natural causes or territorial conflict with its own kind, and leaving behind remains that a careful enough observer might eventually piece together into a case for the species' existence. That theory held for years. It's the theory Holt was working from through most of the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, as he quietly and entirely on his own time began keeping a private log distinct from his official DNR casework, cross-referencing landowner complaints, unusual predation reports on livestock, and any large animal sighting that crossed his desk that didn't neatly fit deer, bear, moose, or wolf, the core species his job actually required him to track. During those years, Holt documented what he now numbers as cases 3 through 6, a string of encounters spread across roughly 4 more years, each one adding incrementally to his private catalog, without fundamentally changing his working theory. Case 3 was another partial carcass, found by a snowplow operator clearing a remote township road at dawn. Close enough to the roadway that Holt was able to photograph tracks in fresh snow leading away from the site. Tracks that, at the time, he interpreted as further confirmation of a bipedal animal, since the print pattern in that instance did show what appeared to be an alternating two-legged gait, though in retrospect, given everything he learned later, he now wonders whether those particular tracks might have belonged to the prey animal fleeing something else entirely, rather than to the predator responsible for the kill site itself. Case 4 and Case 5 were both second-hand, relayed to him by other officers in neighboring districts who'd heard, informally, that Holt had developed something of a quiet specialty in unusual wildlife reports, and who brought him details of their own unresolved incidents rather than filing anything formally themselves. Case 6 was the only one during this stretch that Holt witnessed anything resembling a live encounter for, a brief, distant glimpse of a large dark shape moving through timber at dusk. Too far and too poorly lit for any confident identification, but close enough in general size and coloration to what he'd been documenting that he included it in his private log without hesitation. What broke that theory and replaced it with something considerably stranger was Case 7, which occurred roughly 6 years after Case 1, and which Holt describes, without any hesitation or hedging in his voice when he told us about it, as the day everything he thought he understood about what he was tracking fell apart and had to be rebuilt from scratch. Before we get into Case 7, drop a comment letting us know if you're the kind of viewer who prefers a story that builds slowly toward a reveal like this, layering evidence before the big turn, versus a story that gives you the twist up front. This particular testimony only makes sense told the way Holt insisted on telling it, and we want to know if that structure is working for you. Now, Case 7. Case 7 began with a call that, on its surface, sounded like nothing new. A landowner reporting a strong smell and buzzard activity in a wooded ravine on the edge of his property. The kind of call Holt had responded to dozens of times over the years for perfectly mundane reasons. A deer that died of chronic wasting complications. An old bear that had simply died of age. Holt drove out without any particular urgency, expecting another routine investigation. The landowner, an older man who'd farmed that same parcel his entire life, met Holt at the edge of his property and walked him partway down toward the ravine before stopping, saying he didn't much care to go any further, that the smell alone had been enough to turn his stomach the first time, and he saw no reason to subject himself to it twice. Holt continued on alone, working his way down a steep, brush-choked slope that hadn't seen any kind of maintained trail in years, using a walking stick to test his footing on ground still slick from recent rain. What he found in that ravine, once he'd worked his way down through the brush to the actual site, stopped him completely. It was not one carcass. It was, by his careful count that afternoon, parts of at least 2, possibly 3 separate animals, all showing the same unidentified morphology he'd been quietly cataloging for 6 years. But arranged, and this is the detail Holt returns to again and again, as the single most important observation of his entire unofficial investigation, in a way that did not read as a natural death site or even a single predation event. The remains were separated, spread across roughly 40 yards of ravine floor, with what appeared to be drag marks connecting several of the individual clusters. Drag marks in soil and leaf litter that indicated something had moved these remains after death, redistributing them across the site rather than leaving them where they fell. Holt spent nearly 4 hours at that site that afternoon, far longer than any routine investigation would typically call for, methodically documenting each cluster of remains with his department camera, sketching a rough map of the ravine floor in his personal notebook, showing the relative position of each set of bones and the drag marks connecting them, and collecting soil and hair samples into small evidence bags he kept in his truck for exactly this kind of unofficial personal documentation. He remembers the ravine growing noticeably colder as the afternoon light began to fail, and remembers more than once having the distinct sensation of being watched from the tree line above him. Though he never saw anything directly and attributed the feeling, at the time, to simple nerves given the disturbing nature of what he was looking at. Holt, with his biologist colleagues' help again, this time bringing him directly to the site itself under the pretense of a routine large carnivore consultation, documented something that neither man could reconcile with any known predator behavior in the region. The bite and claw marks visible on the remains, where soft tissue still allowed for any analysis at all, were consistent with an attacker considerably larger and more powerful than anything either man had direct experience with in North American wildlife, larger than the black bear, larger in terms of applied force per the biologist's rough estimate based on bone fracture patterns, than anything either of them was prepared to put a name to that day. Before we continue, drop a comment if this detail changes how you're thinking about the story so far. The idea that what Holt had spent 6 years documenting as isolated deaths of a single unidentified species might actually be evidence of that species being actively hunted by something else entirely. It's the pivot point of this entire testimony, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Now let's continue with what Holt did next. That night, driving back from the ravine alone, Holt says he had to pull his truck over on a Forest Service road for almost 20 minutes because his hands were shaking too badly to keep driving safely, not from fear exactly. Though fear was certainly part of it, but from the sheer scale of what he was suddenly forced to consider. For 6 years he had believed, cautiously and privately, that he was documenting evidence of an undiscovered primate species, essentially a real-world Bigfoot, dying of natural or incidental causes across his patrol district. Case 7 forced him to consider that the animal he'd been calling, in the privacy of his own notebook, the big one, was not the apex predator of this story at all. It was prey. Holt spent the better part of the next 2 years, entirely on his own time and largely alone, trying to figure out what exactly was capable of hunting and killing something the size and apparent strength of what he'd been documenting. He went back through decades of old DNR records, looking for anomalous large predator reports that predated his own tenure. Spoke carefully and indirectly with a handful of retired officers and a few older residents of the area whose families had lived in the region for generations, always framing his questions vaguely enough that he never had to explain what he was actually asking about. That research took him into the basement archive of the County Historical Society more times than he can count, working through microfilmed newspaper records going back to the early 20th century, looking specifically for reports of unusual livestock losses, unexplained large animal sightings, or anything else that might hint at a pattern predating his own career by decades. He found scattered references, brief mentions in old farm reports of some varmint taking sheep in a particularly aggressive and unusual manner during a handful of specific years. References too vague on their own to build any kind of case from, but that, taken together with everything else he was gathering, began to suggest a pattern of intermittent activity stretching back at least as far as records existed for that part of the county. He also began cautiously approaching people directly, always through some pretext connected to his actual job, a routine property check, a courtesy call about hunting regulations, using those visits as cover to gently steer conversation toward any unusual animal encounters the person or their family might have had over the years. He describes this period as feeling, more than anything else in his career, like a kind of secret second job, one he could never discuss with his own supervisors or for a long time, even fully with his own wife, who by this point had come to understand that her husband was chasing something he wouldn't fully explain to her, but who had stopped asking directly. A silence between them that Holt now recognizes as one of the earliest cracks in a marriage that would eventually end. Before we go on, drop a comment if you've ever spent your own free time quietly researching something you couldn't explain through your job, piecing together fragments from old records, or from conversations with people who might know more than they let on. That kind of unofficial, self-directed investigation is exactly what defines the next stretch of Holt's story. Now let's get into what he found. What Holt eventually assembled, piece by piece over those 2 years, was a body of second-hand and third-hand testimony, almost none of it formally documented anywhere, describing an animal that local families in certain pockets of the Upper Peninsula had apparently known about, in the same quiet, unofficial way rural communities everywhere seem to know about things that never make it into any wildlife agency's official species list. The descriptions varied in detail but converged on a consistent general profile, an animal larger and heavier than the creature Holt had been documenting for years as the primary anomaly, with a build that several of his older sources described, independently of each other, using language closer to feline than canine, low-slung, powerful through the shoulders and forelimbs, moving with what more than one source described as an unsettling silence for something of its apparent size. One elderly source in particular, a woman in her 90s at the time Holt spoke with her, whose family had worked timber in the region for 4 generations, told him something that he wrote down verbatim, and that he still considers the single most important piece of testimony in his entire unofficial file. She told him that her grandfather used to say there were 2 things in the deep woods that a person needed to know about and needed to leave alone. One that walked like a man and smelled like a wet dog, and one that walked like nothing at all and smelled like nothing you'd ever want to get close enough to smell. Her grandfather, according to her, had always been careful to specify that the second thing wasn't interested in people. It was interested, in her grandfather's own words as she remembered them, in the first thing. Holt visited that same woman 3 more times over the following year, bringing small gifts each time, firewood, a bag of groceries, nothing that could be mistaken for payment. Simply the kind of respectful courtesy that rural communities in that part of the state expect from anyone asking for someone's time and memory. On his second visit, she told him something she hadn't mentioned the first time, that her own father, this woman's father, had once come home from a trapline check badly shaken, refusing to say exactly what he'd seen, but insisting the family keep their dogs tied up close to the house for the rest of that particular winter, a precaution she said the family maintained. Without ever fully explaining why to the children, for years afterward, whenever a certain kind of unusually warm, wet winter came through, conditions her father apparently associated, for reasons lost to time, with increased activity from whatever it was he'd encountered. A second source, a retired trapper in his 80s, whom Holt located through a mutual acquaintance at the county fair, offered a detail that stuck with Holt even more than the elderly woman's family history had. This trapper described finding, decades earlier, a section of his trapline completely destroyed overnight, not simply sprung or stolen, which happens occasionally with any trapline, but physically torn apart, steel traps bent and twisted in ways he said he'd never seen from any animal before or since, and a set of tracks nearby that he'd sketched from memory into a small pocket notebook he still had and was willing to show Holt. The sketch, crude but detailed enough to be useful, showed a rounded 4-toed print with no visible claw marks, a detail Holt immediately recognized as significant. Since retractable claws are a hallmark of felid tracks specifically, distinguishing them from the always visible claw marks typical of canid prints. Before we continue, drop a comment if a piece of oral family history like that. 3 or 4 generations removed from the original source, but consistent enough in its details to feel like more than a simple campfire tale, would be enough to convince you that something real sits behind it. It's exactly this kind of layered, independently corroborated folklore that gave Holt the confidence to keep investigating instead of writing the whole thing off. Now let's get into Holt's own direct encounter, because up to this point in the story, everything he'd experienced was secondhand, through carcasses and through other people's stories. That changed. Holt's own direct encounter with what he came to privately call, in his notebook and nowhere else, the second animal, happened roughly 8 years after Case 1. On a late autumn night during a routine night patrol, he was running alone, checking a series of remote access points along a stretch of national forest boundary known for occasional poaching activity after dark. It was the kind of patrol he'd run hundreds of times before without incident, driving slow with his headlights off along a 2-track logging road, using a spotlight only when he had specific reason to. He'd chosen that particular night, he remembers, because the weather conditions were exactly the kind that historically produced the best odds of catching illegal night hunting activity: a clear, cold, still night with a bright enough moon to let would-be poachers see well enough to shoot without needing a spotlight of their own, which would have given away their position to any patrolling officer. He'd parked his truck at a pull-off roughly 1.5 miles from his final checkpoint and set out on foot, a decision consistent with dozens of similar patrols he'd run over the years, moving quietly along the edge of the 2-track rather than driving the whole distance, giving himself the best chance of hearing or seeing anything unusual before announcing his presence with headlights or engine noise. He'd parked his truck at a pull-off and was walking on foot along a section of trail he knew well, checking for fresh tire tracks that might indicate recent illegal activity, when he became aware, in a way he still struggles to fully articulate, that the woods around him had gone completely silent. Not the ordinary quiet of a cold autumn night, but a total absence of the ambient sound he'd come to expect from decades of night work in that same stretch of forest. No owls, no distant coyote activity, nothing. He describes trying in the moment to talk himself into a mundane explanation, telling himself that perhaps a great horned owl had simply moved through the area recently enough to suppress smaller nocturnal activity, a phenomenon he'd genuinely observed before in his career. But something about the totality of the silence, the sense that even the wind moving through the hemlock canopy overhead seemed muted somehow, told him, on some level below conscious reasoning, that this was different from anything he'd experienced in 3 decades of night work in that same general area. Before we continue, drop a comment if you've ever experienced that specific kind of unnatural silence yourself, in any wild setting, and what it turned out to mean. It's one of the most consistently reported details across testimony like this, and Holt's description of it matches almost exactly what other witnesses on this channel have described in completely unrelated cases. Now let's get into what happened next. Holt describes stopping completely still on the trail, every instinct built over decades of fieldwork telling him that something large was close by, though he could see nothing in the darkness beyond the narrow cone of his flashlight. He made the decision, when he still second guesses to this day, to switch the flashlight off entirely rather than risk drawing attention to his exact position, standing instead in near total darkness. Listening. Standing there, he says, his eyes slowly adjusting to the moonlight filtering down through bare late autumn branches overhead. He became aware of his own pulse in a way he'd rarely experienced even during moments of genuine professional danger earlier in his career: arrests of armed poachers, confrontations with intoxicated hunters. This felt different, a kind of primal alertness he associates now, having read about it since in books on human physiology, with the oldest, least conscious layers of threat response the human nervous system carries. What he heard, after what he estimates was close to 2 full minutes of silence, was a low sound that he can only describe as a kind of exhale, deep and controlled, coming from a point in the woods roughly 30 to 40 yards off the trail, at a height that, based on the angle of the sound relative to his own position, suggested something considerably taller than himself. He describes his own heart rate in that moment with the precision of a man who has relived it many times since, and says that despite 31 years of wildlife encounters, Nothing in his career before or after produced the specific, total body alertness he felt standing on that trail in the dark. He remained frozen, he estimates, for close to 3 full minutes after that first sound, not moving, barely breathing, listening for any indication of movement toward his position. None came. Whatever was out there in the darkness, he says, seemed content, at least in that moment, simply to remain where it was. And the fact that it never approached closer despite what must have been ample opportunity is a detail he's come back to many times since as evidence that whatever this animal is, it does not appear to view human beings as prey in any straightforward sense, a conclusion that offers him a strange, limited kind of comfort even now. He did not run. He credits decades of training and experience with predator encounters, mostly black bear, for the discipline that kept him rooted in place rather than triggering what would likely have been a fatal flight response if the animal had been inclined to give chase. Instead, he backed away slowly, one careful step at a time, keeping his flashlight off, until he judged he'd put enough distance between himself and the sound to risk turning and walking, not running. Back toward his truck. The walk back to his truck, he says, took what felt like an eternity, though his own later calculation, based on the time stamps on his radio log for that shift, suggests it was closer to 25 minutes for a distance that would normally take him perhaps 10. He remembers sitting in the driver's seat afterward for several minutes before he trusted his hands enough to start the engine, and remembers driving the rest of that patrol shift with every sense on a kind of heightened alert he wouldn't fully shake for days afterward. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think Holt's instinct to freeze and retreat slowly, rather than run, likely saved his life that night, based on what we already know from other predator encounter testimony on this channel. Now let's get to the detail that convinced Holt, more than anything else in this entire story, that what he'd encountered that night was not the same animal responsible for the decades of dogmen folklore in his region. The following morning, at first light, Holt returned to the same stretch of trail alone and spent almost 3 hours conducting a careful, methodical search of the area. The same kind of search he would have run for any wildlife incident investigation, photographing and measuring everything he found. He'd brought a plaster casting kit from his own personal equipment, the kind he sometimes used for documenting legitimate wildlife track evidence in poaching investigations, and worked slowly and carefully, wanting to make absolutely certain any cast he took would hold up to scrutiny if he ever did decide to share it with someone qualified to evaluate it. What he found were tracks, partial and imperfect in the leaf litter and soft ground off the trail, but consistent enough in their spacing and their depth to tell him 2 things clearly. First, that whatever had been standing in those woods the night before was heavier, considerably heavier, than any bear track he had documented in 3 decades of fieldwork in that exact terrain. He estimated, based on the depth of impression in ground, he knew well enough to compare against dozens of prior bear tracks in similar soil conditions, that the animal likely weighed somewhere in the range of 400 to 500 pounds, a figure that, when he first calculated it sitting in his truck afterward, made him briefly doubt his own measurements simply because it seemed too large to be plausible for anything that could move as silently as what he'd heard. Second, and this is the detail that mattered most to him, the print pattern showed a paw structure, not a humanoid or semi-humanoid foot at all, 4 clear toe pads arranged around a central pad, consistent with the general architecture of a large felid, not any canid, and certainly not anything resembling the bipedal humanoid track pattern that dogmen witnesses across the region had been reporting for decades. He compared the cast, once it had cured, against reference photographs of mountain lion tracks from western states, the closest large felid track pattern he had access to for comparison, and found the general architecture similar but the scale dramatically larger. Roughly 1.5 times the size of even the largest documented mountain lion track he could find in any reference material. Before we continue, drop a comment if this detail, a feline rather than canine or humanoid track structure, surprises you as much as it surprised Holt when he first documented it. It's the piece of physical evidence that reframed his entire 6-year investigation, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Now let's get into how Holt's thinking evolved from here. Holt spent the rest of that final decade of active investigation, roughly from his encounter through the last several years before his retirement, quietly assembling what he now believes, with as much confidence as he's willing to claim for something entirely undocumented by mainstream science, is a coherent picture of a predator-prey relationship playing out in the deep forest of the Upper Peninsula that no wildlife agency, no university research program, and no cryptid enthusiast community has ever properly documented, because almost nobody has ever had access to both halves of the picture at once. During those final years, Holt documented 4 additional cases involving what he now firmly categorized as the second animal. None involving another direct encounter as close as his own night on the trail, but several involving further track evidence. One involving a trail camera photograph so blurred and poorly framed that Holt himself, despite everything he knew, hesitated to include it in his private file with any real confidence. And one final carcass site, discovered in his last full year before retirement. That showed the clearest evidence, yet of the predation dynamic he'd come to believe defined the relationship between the two species, a single individual of the primary anomalous species. Killed with the same overwhelming force he'd documented at Case 7, but this time found largely intact. With far less evidence of the site having been disturbed or the remains redistributed afterward, a difference Holt has never been able to fully explain. Though he wonders whether it simply reflects the second animal having been interrupted or having simply chosen, for reasons of its own, not to linger at that particular kill site. The DOGMEN community, he points out, focuses almost entirely on sightings of the bipedal canid figure itself, without any awareness of the carcasses Holt had spent years quietly cataloging. And the handful of people, mostly old-timers with deep multi-generational roots in specific pockets of the region, who seemed to know something about the second animal, the feline-built predator, had never connected their own family folklore to the DOGMEN phenomenon at all, treating the two as entirely separate pieces of local lore that happened to occupy the same forest. It was Holt, as far as he knows, and as far as our own research for this video has been able to confirm, who was the first person to actually connect the two. To realize that the string of anomalous carcasses he'd been documenting for years, carcasses matching the general morphological profile that DOGMEN witnesses across the region described in their sightings, were not simply the natural deaths of an otherwise undocumented species, but likely represented the kill sites of an even larger, even less documented predator that specifically hunted them. Before we continue, drop a comment if you find it more unsettling to think about a top-tier predator hunting something as formidable as the creature described in DOGMEN folklore, rather than a predator hunting deer or livestock, the way we're used to thinking about apex predators. That inversion, the idea that something out there considers the DOGMEN prey rather than the apex threat, is exactly what makes this testimony feel different from every other piece of Michigan cryptid lore we've covered on this channel. Now let's get into what finally pushed Holt toward retirement and toward the decision to burn most of his own case file. Holt is careful when he talks about the final years of his career, to separate the professional pressures of an increasingly demanding job in a chronically understaffed department from the personal weight of carrying, essentially alone, a body of evidence he could never share through any official channel without ending his career, and in his own words, making himself look either incompetent or unstable to the very community he'd spent decades earning the trust of. But he acknowledges that the two were connected, that the emotional toll of quietly documenting evidence of two entirely undiscovered large predator species sharing his patrol district, one of which he now believed capable of killing something the size and strength of the DOGMEN with apparent regularity, contributed directly to a level of chronic stress that he now recognizes. With the benefit of hindsight and some help from a therapist, he began seeing several years into retirement as something close to a sustained low-grade trauma response that lasted for years. He describes the therapy itself, which he began somewhat reluctantly at his daughter's gentle insistence, as one of the more difficult undertakings of his life. Not because talking about his feelings was inherently uncomfortable, but because he spent the first several months of sessions unable to explain the actual source of the stress he was working through, describing it only in the vaguest possible terms: work-related anxiety, unprocessed stress from decades of a demanding job, without ever telling his therapist the specific content of what had been weighing on him. It wasn't until nearly a year into the process, he says, that he finally decided to tell her the truth, bracing himself for a reaction that would end the relationship, or at minimum change how she saw him professionally. That didn't happen. His therapist, according to Holt, listened to the entire account without visible skepticism or alarm, and responded when he'd finished, not by questioning the reality of what he described, but by asking him a single question that he says reframed the entire remaining course of his treatment. Whether he had ever allowed himself to grieve the version of his career and his relationship with the natural world that he'd lost the moment case, one forced him to realize the woods held something his training had never prepared him for. He hadn't. Working through that grief, he says, turned out to be the actual project of the following several years of therapy, far more than processing any specific fear connected to the second animal itself. He retired at 59 several years before he was strictly required to, in part, he admits now. Because he had reached a point where he could no longer trust his own read of the woods he'd patrolled his entire adult life, a woods he'd once known with the kind of total, unthinking familiarity that decades of fieldwork gives a person, and that he now walked through, even on routine patrols in broad daylight. With a low-grade vigilance he describes as exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. His final years on the job, he says, were marked by a growing awareness of his own diminished capacity for the kind of instinctive confidence the work required. Moments where he'd catch himself hesitating before entering a stretch of timber he'd walked 1,000 times before, running mental calculations about sound and sightlines, and escape routes that had nothing to do with any legitimate law enforcement concern and everything to do with a private, unshakable awareness that something considerably more dangerous than any documented species might be watching him from the tree line. He never let that hesitation show to colleagues, he says, a discipline that itself became exhausting to maintain over the final several years of his career. Before we continue, drop a comment if you've ever experienced that specific kind of exhaustion yourself. The mental toll of sustained vigilance in an environment you once found completely comfortable and familiar. It's a detail that comes up again and again in long-term testimony like this, and it says something important about the real cost these encounters extract from the people who live through them, even when nothing ever physically harms them directly. Now let's get to the burn barrel and to why Holt decided after decades of careful, methodical documentation to destroy almost all of it. The decision, as Holt describes it, wasn't sudden. It built slowly across his first 5 years of retirement, a period during which he initially imagined he might finally have the time and freedom to organize his private notes into something more formal. Perhaps even reach out to a university researcher he'd cautiously trusted over the years, someone who'd shown genuine, careful interest in unusual wildlife, reports without ever pushing Holt toward any conclusion he wasn't ready to reach on his own. What changed his mind in the end wasn't any new encounter or any new piece of evidence. It was, according to Holt, a conversation with his own adult daughter, the same daughter who would later secretly photograph the notebooks before he destroyed them, during which she gently raised a concern that had apparently been building in her for years, that her father's decades-long preoccupation with what she still, at that point, understood only vaguely as the animal thing had cost him something real. Friendships he'd let lapse rather than explain his frequent solo trips back into remote sections of the forest long after retirement. A marriage that had ended amicably but not painlessly, partly under the weight of secrets he'd never fully shared even with his own wife. And a kind of low-grade isolation that had crept into his life, so gradually he'd barely noticed it happening. That conversation took place, Holt remembers with unusual precision, on his back porch on a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, almost exactly a year before he finally decided to burn the notebooks. His daughter, who by that point had her own young children and had begun, she told him, noticing patterns in his behavior that worried her as a parent watching her own father. Patterns she recognized from her professional work as a school counselor, patterns she associated with unprocessed trauma more than with any healthy long-term hobby or interest. She didn't ask him to explain what he'd been documenting all those years. She asked him instead a simpler and in some ways more difficult question, whether he was happy, and whether he believed the thing he'd spent decades quietly carrying had made his life better or worse. Holt says he didn't have an honest answer for her in that moment, and that the inability to answer that simple question more than anything else is what finally convinced him something had to change. He spent the following year turning the question over in his mind almost constantly, gradually arriving at the conclusion that whatever scientific or historical value his decades of documentation might theoretically hold, it had come at a cost to his own life and to the people closest to him that he was no longer willing to keep paying. Especially not for a discovery he had no realistic path toward ever sharing safely or credibly with the wider world. The burn itself, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic in its ordinariness, according to Holt. A Saturday afternoon in late spring, clear skies, no wind to speak of, conditions he'd specifically chosen because they minimized any fire risk. He'd set up an old metal burn barrel he'd used for years for ordinary yard debris, and worked through the stack of notebooks one at a time, feeding pages in steadily rather than dumping them all in at once, a process that took the better part of 2 hours. He describes standing there watching decades of his own careful handwriting curl and blacken, feeling, in his own words, something closer to relief than grief. Though he acknowledges now that the relief was likely mixed with a grief he wasn't fully able to access in the moment itself. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think Holt made the right call, protecting the people closest to him by finally letting go of a burden he'd carried largely alone for decades. Or if you think something valuable was lost when he destroyed the bulk of his own documentation. It's one of the most difficult questions this testimony raises, and Holt himself even now doesn't fully know where he lands on it. Now let's get into what he kept and why. Holt didn't destroy everything. He kept deliberately a small handful of items, a single measured skull fragment from Case 7 that he still has, wrapped and stored in a way he wouldn't describe to us in detail. The photograph of the feline track cast from the night of his own direct encounter, and crucially the conversation itself, which he's now had slowly and carefully with his daughter over the past several years, filling in details bit by bit as he judges her ready to hear them. A process he describes as far harder than anything he ever did professionally in 3 decades of fieldwork. His daughter, for her part, made the decision to photograph the notebooks before the burn without telling him, a choice she since told him about, and one that, according to Holt, led to one of the most difficult conversations of his life, not because he was angry at the deception, but because it forced him to finally reckon directly with the fact that some part of him had always wanted the record to survive, even as another part of him needed, for his own sense of peace, to physically watch it burn. She told him about the photographs almost 2 years after the burn itself, during a visit home, choosing the moment carefully, she later admitted, because she'd spent those 2 years trying to decide whether telling him would help him or hurt him, ultimately deciding that continuing to keep the secret herself was becoming its own kind of quiet burden she no longer wanted to carry, an echo, she pointed out, to her own father with some gentle irony, of exactly the pattern he himself had modeled for her throughout her entire childhood. Before we continue, drop a comment if you understand that contradiction, wanting something destroyed and preserved at the same time, and whether you think that tension is common among people who carry this kind of long-term, undocumented knowledge largely alone. Now let's move toward the close of this testimony, because there's one more piece of it that Holt wanted us to include, something that happened just under 2 years ago, well into his retirement. Holt still lives in the Upper Peninsula, in a house he and his ex-wife bought decades ago, close enough to his old patrol district that he sees former colleagues regularly at the grocery store or the hardware store in town. Almost 2 years ago, one of those former colleagues, a much younger officer who has now taken over patrol responsibilities for a portion of Holt's old district, approached him after church, of all places, and asked carefully, almost apologetically, whether Holt had ever during his career come across anything strange out past the old Fire Tower Road, a specific stretch of forest that Holt immediately recognized as sitting almost directly on top of what he privately still thinks of as the heart of the second animal's territory. Holt describes standing in that parking lot, coffee cup in hand, feeling the entire weight of his 31-year career settle back onto his shoulders in the space of a single sentence. He asked the younger officer carefully what had prompted the question, and listened as the man described with visible discomfort an incident from a few months earlier. A trail camera set up as part of a legitimate deer population study that had captured, across 2 separate nights roughly a week apart, images too blurred and too poorly framed to make any formal determination from, but clear enough in outline that the younger officer, alone in his own truck reviewing the footage late one evening, had felt a version of the same unease Holt himself had carried privately for decades. Holt describes that conversation as one of the strangest moments of his entire retirement, standing in a church parking lot being asked, almost 30 years after his own first anomalous carcass. The exact question he'd spent decades hoping nobody would ever have reason to ask him again. He didn't tell the younger officer everything. He's still deciding, even now, how much of what he knows he owes to the next generation of people doing this job, people who deserve to know what might genuinely be out there, and how much silence he still believes is the safer, more responsible choice, both for the department's institutional credibility and in some strange way he struggles to fully explain. For the animals themselves. What he did tell the younger officer in that parking lot was a carefully edited version of the truth, that yes, he'd encountered things over the years he couldn't fully explain. That the Fire Tower Road area in particular had always struck him as worth extra caution on night patrols, and that if the younger man ever found himself in a similar situation, hearing something he couldn't identify, seeing tracks that didn't match anything in the field guides, the most important thing he could do was trust his own instincts about when to retreat rather than push forward for a clearer look. He stopped short, deliberately, of describing Case 7, of describing his own night on the trail, of naming either animal by any of the private terms he'd used in his notebooks for decades. He told us that decision, made in the moment without much conscious deliberation, still feels to him like the right one, though he acknowledges he may revisit it as the younger officer, whom he's stayed in occasional contact with since, continues working that same stretch of territory. Before we get to Holt's closing reflection, there's one more piece of this story we want to include, something we uncovered ourselves during the research for this video, entirely independent of anything Holt originally told us. While verifying background details about Upper Peninsula conservation officer staffing patterns during the 1980s and 1990s, we came across a retired officer from a neighboring district. A man we'll call Warden Prout, who worked a territory bordering Holt's own for the better part of 2 decades, and who agreed. Once we explained in general terms the nature of the testimony we were gathering, to speak with us briefly about his own experiences. Prout had never met Holt personally, as far as either man could recall when we eventually connected them by phone during our research, despite having worked adjoining districts for years. A detail that speaks to just how vast and thinly staffed the Upper Peninsula Conservation Officer network actually was during that era. What Prout described to us, independently and without any prompting from anything we'd already learned from Holt, was a set of experiences that align with Holt's testimony closely enough that we felt it belonged in this video, offered as a second, entirely independent thread of evidence, rather than folded seamlessly into Holt's own account. Prout described over the course of his own career, encountering what he called big cat sign on at least 6 separate occasions across roughly 15 years tracks. Scat samples he'd sent informally to a contact at a state university lab without ever receiving a satisfying formal identification back, and on one occasion, a partial livestock kill that he still describes as the most disturbing scene of his entire career, a full-grown horse. Not a small calf or a sheep, but an adult horse weighing well over 1,000 pounds, found dead in a pasture with injuries that Prout, even now, struggles to attribute to any known North American predator. Before we continue, drop a comment if hearing a second, entirely independent officer's testimony, gathered separately from Holt's own account, changes how credible this overall story feels to you. Corroboration from unconnected sources is exactly the kind of detail that separates documented testimony from simple rumor. And it's rare that we're able to bring you 2 independent threads pointing at the same phenomenon in a single video. Now let's get into what Prout told us about that horse. Prout described arriving at the pasture on a cold morning in early spring, called out by a distraught owner who'd found the animal at first light. The horse, according to Prout's own notes from the investigation, which he still had and read to us over the phone, had died from what appeared to be a single massive traumatic injury to the neck and upper shoulder region, an injury Prout, drawing on his own extensive experience investigating livestock predation cases involving wolves, coyotes, and the occasional black bear, could not reconcile with any known predator's typical kill method on an animal of that size. Wolves, he explained, typically bring down large prey through a combination of harassment and repeated attacks that leave extensive evidence of a prolonged struggle. What he found at that pasture showed almost none of that. A single point of catastrophic injury, minimal surrounding disturbance, and most disturbingly to Prout at the time, almost no blood at the actual kill site itself, a detail that led him, informally and never in any official report, to wonder whether the animal had somehow been killed elsewhere and moved, an idea he dismissed at the time as impossible given the horse's size, but which he now, having heard even the general outline of Holt's testimony secondhand through us, finds himself reconsidering. Prout never connected his own experiences to the DOGMEN folklore that circulated through his own district over the years. In much the same way Holt described the old-timers in his own area, treating the two threads of local lore as entirely separate phenomena. When we asked Prout carefully whether he'd ever heard stories in his own district about a bipedal, canine-featured animal alongside whatever had been responsible for the horse and the other livestock incidents he'd investigated, he told us that yes, he had, dismissing them at the time. Exactly as Holt once had, as likely misidentified bear sightings or local exaggeration, without ever considering that the two threads of folklore in his district, the bipedal canid and the unidentified large predator responsible for kills like the horse, might in fact describe two separate animals locked in the same relationship. Holt had spent decades quietly documenting one district over. Prout's own retirement came earlier than Holt's, at 52, following a workplace injury unrelated to any of this that ended his field career on medical grounds. He told us that hearing even a partial outline of Holt's story, filtered through our own careful, anonymized retelling of it, was one of the strangest phone calls of his life. A sensation he described as something between relief and dread. Relief at finally having a framework that made sense of his own unexplained horse case after so many years, and dread at the confirmation that whatever he'd brushed up against in his own career was, as best either man can tell, still very much active in that same stretch of forest. We asked both men, separately, whether they'd be willing to speak with each other directly, now that we'd made the connection between their two districts and their 2 decades of eerily parallel, entirely independent documentation. Both said they'd consider it. As of the time we finished production on this video, neither had yet reached out to the other, though Holt told us, in our final conversation before we finished this testimony, that he suspected it was only a matter of time, and that some part of him was relieved to finally know he wasn't the only conservation officer in the Upper Peninsula who had quietly carried this particular weight alone for most of his career. Before we get to Holt's final closing reflection, drop a comment if you think these two independent testimonies, gathered from officers who never knew each other despite working adjoining territories for decades, strengthen the overall case for what both men believe they encountered. And let us know if you'd want us to follow up in a future video if Holt and Prout do eventually connect and compare notes directly. Now finally, let's close with Holt's own words. When we asked Holt near the end of our long conversation with him what he hoped people would take away from finally hearing a version of this story, even in the incomplete, carefully protected form he was willing to share, he thought about it for a long time before answering. He said that for most of his career, he assumed the scariest thing in the woods was whatever sat at the very top, the biggest, strongest, most dangerous animal a person could possibly encounter. What 31 years and 2 undiscovered species taught him, he said, is that the woods don't actually work that way. That there's always something further up the chain than whatever you've already found, and that the moment you think you've identified the apex of anything, in the natural world or otherwise, is usually the exact moment you've stopped looking closely enough. He expanded on that thought a bit further, telling us that one of the hardest lessons of his entire career, harder even than the fear of the encounters themselves, was learning to sit with genuine, permanent uncertainty, the knowledge that he would very likely die without ever having a satisfying, complete answer to what he'd spent decades documenting. Without ever knowing for certain how many individuals of either species remained, how large their combined range truly extended, or whether either animal would still exist in that forest a generation from now, given the same pressures of habitat loss and human encroachment affecting every other large predator species across the country. That uncertainty, he said, used to feel unbearable to him. Now, with the distance of retirement and years of therapy behind him, he describes it as something closer to a strange kind of peace. An acceptance that some things in the world are simply going to remain larger than any single person's capacity to fully understand them. He said one more thing right at the very end that we want to leave you with tonight. He said that in 31 years of fieldwork, across 2 separate, entirely undocumented species sharing the same stretch of forest, he never once found evidence that either animal had deliberately harmed a human being, not the one the folklore calls the DOGMEN, and not the one his own daughter. Hearing the story for the first time as an adult, ended up naming herself, half as a joke and half because the name stuck, the Shadow Cat. Whatever these things are, he said, and whatever is still out there hunting them in turn, they seem, as far as 3 decades of careful documentation ever showed him, to want almost nothing to do with us at all. He said that's the part that still keeps him up some nights, not the fear of what might be watching from the tree line, but the quiet, unshakable certainty that it's been watching for a very long time, and has simply, so far, chosen to let us be. If this story reached you the way Holt's testimony reached us, drop a comment telling us which part stuck with you most, the first unidentified carcass, the feline track cast from his own encounter, or the conversation in the church parking lot that told him this story is still unfolding even now. Subscribe if you haven't already, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next testimony, and we'll see you in the next video, because if 3 decades of one warden's quiet, careful documentation are any indication, the forests of the Upper Peninsula are still holding a great deal more than any official record has ever been willing to admit.